In this video, we will talk about how we measure reading comprehension. There are many different kinds of reading comprehension tests. One kind is called close, in which some words are removed from a passage and the person being tested has to fill them in. Another way is via retell, where the person has to read the story and then they have to retell the story in their own words without looking at it. A very common way to test reading comprehension involves asking people to read a passage and then asking them questions. And these can be open-ended questions where we have to note what they answer, or they can be multiple choice questions where we give them some options and they have to choose. Questions can be targeted at different kinds of information or different aspects of comprehension. For example, some questions may target recall by asking for a specific information that was in the text. Other questions can ask for integration. So they may require the person tested to combine information that is in the text but at different places. Other questions may ask about inferences, so asking about things that aren't explicitly stated in the text but implied by it or necessary for it to make sense. And other questions can probe global inferences, which concerns the person's ability to use background knowledge or to derive the general gist of the whole passage. Let us now look at some examples. Close tests are often made by removing every fifth or seventh word from a passage, like in this case. And you can see that some of the missing words are pronouns, other can be prepositions or verbs. And the knowledge required for filling each of these in can be quite different. This is even more obvious in this example, which is a multiple choice close. So there are specific options for this location in the passage. One must choose among these options, these words, and other options are given for this location. And you can see that this is a grammatical choice, but this is a lexical choice. The common format of reading a passage and then having questions asked can take many different forms. Typically, passages used in this type of assessment are relatively short. Pause this video to read this passage before you move on. As you can see, the different options here are constructed carefully so that the right one does not include anything that is explicitly stated in these words. It is a rephrasing, so that someone cannot answer this question simply by looking for this sentence in the text, but they must have understood the corresponding sentence, which is phrased in a different way. There are some options that are also not present in the text and are in fact common sense answers to this question aimed at people who do not understand the text at all and might opt to choose something that looks reasonable. There is also another lure here, which includes a phrase taken from the passage for people who haven't understood the passage and will be looking for something to match. So the construction of the multiple choice tests is a very involved process in which the different options must be very carefully considered and contrasted with the correct option so that people are tested for the specific intended skill or knowledge. How can you test inference making? There are different ways to do that, and you can do that with different formats. Pause this video to read this brief passage here, the highlighted section. An inference is obviously required to go from this sentence to this sentence. Something must be contributed so that the internal model will represent a relationship between the idea about a kind of jam and the decision to buy some jars. if the text is to make global sense. So one way to probe that is by directly asking, what did Hannah need the nice jars for? And then you have to evaluate the quality of the answer. Another way to probe that is with a multiple choice question. The same question with some options. So again, the options must be chosen very carefully so that they're equally relatable to the text, but only one makes sense. You can use a true-false question. So you give a possible inference and ask the person being tested to evaluate it. In a closed task, you would ask the participant to make the inference by choosing the appropriate word among a set that are equally relevant to the passage and also grammatically appropriate. The decision about whether to use open-ended questions or multiple choice questions is not straightforward. There are advantages and disadvantages with each choice. Open-ended questions can be very sensitive in the sense that in order to be answered correctly, the person must have a sufficiently rich and stable representation of their situation model for the passage that they can draw on in order to formulate and then produce a response. So if anything is weak in this procedure, the answer will not be of high quality. And an open-ended question can therefore detect even slight weaknesses. In contrast, multiple choice questions provide some support by the cues that they provide in the options. And this is why it is very important to construct the options appropriately. So one can read the different options and in this way remind themselves of the content or the meaning of the passage and decide whether each option is a good match or not. Open-ended questions have a very broad scope because they can include multiple elements and therefore there are many things that can be evaluated based on the answer. In contrast, multiple choice questions tend to be targeted and indeed have to be targeted if they are to support a good choice of alternative options. Therefore, multiple choice questions are best designed to test very specific elements. Open-ended questions cannot distinguish whether someone does not answer correctly because they did not understand the passage or because they forgot the situation model in the meantime or they are unable to formulate an answer. Multiple choice questions are not affected by retrieval difficulties because they present the different options in full, so someone doesn't have to remember them but can reconstruct the passage based on the alternatives. Open-ended questions, therefore, also depend on expressive language because in order to formulate a good answer, one must be a good user of the language. In contrast, no expression is required for a multiple choice question as the person being tested simply chooses one of the alternatives. Therefore, multiple choice questions are not only more targeted, but also more directly and more specifically related to comprehension than open-ended questions, which are affected by memory and general expressive language issues. Because of the broad scope of open-ended questions, it is very difficult to probe specific aspects of comprehension with open-ended questions and to test specific subskills because the persons will answer whatever they want to answer. So you can't know if something was omitted by their answer because they chose not to say it or because they did not remember it or did not include it in their internal representation in the first place. In contrast, multiple choice questions are tailored individually in order to probe very specific subskills, or at least this is possible to do if the options are chosen and constructed appropriately. Finally, open-ended questions are difficult to score and include a subjective element because someone has to go through the response and evaluate different aspects of it according to guidelines, which is also a threat to reliability because different people might have different subjective opinions about this. In contrast, multiple choice questions are very easy to score and indeed can be scored entirely automatically. However, it has to be remembered that multiple choice questions are much harder to construct if someone wants to test every aspect of understanding, because you will need a targeted question with appropriate alternatives for each different thing that you want to test. Here is an example of rules for scoring a retell test. You can pause this video to read this example. As you see, there are different things that someone scoring a retell has to look for. Of course, you have to listen to the whole retell or read it if there is a transcript, and then you have to do a subjective quality evaluation, and you also have to do some sort of quantitative evaluation by things like counting the words in this case. And there are different procedures for these things, and there are different ways to ensure or at least maximize the reliability by checking if different scorers would give the same score to the same retellings. This is obviously a quite involved process. The closed format, which seems to be quite limiting, can be used in fact to test different things. Pause this video to read the brief passage here in the highlighted section. As you see, the first choice concerns spelling. The second one concerns knowledge of geography. The third one concerns vocabulary. And the fourth one concerns grammar. So you can test very different kinds of things by appropriately constructing a closed test rather than by blindly removing every fifth or seventh word as commonly done. A question that arises after all these different options is, what do we really measure when we have a test of this sort? Well, different tests are now known to depend on a different mix of skills. So, of course, they're all related, meaning that if you do well on a closed test, you will probably do well on a multiple choice test as well, and on a retell as well. But performance on the different types is not perfectly correlated because each one has somewhat different requirements. Different kinds of tests have also differential, concurrent, and longitudinal associations. That means that performance on a closed test of comprehension and performance on a multiple choice test of comprehension have different correlations with other reading and language skills. The diversity of these tests stands in parallel to the complexity and multidimensionality of the understanding concept. As we've seen, there is much that's going into the understanding process, and therefore many different aspects of it that may be stronger or weaker and that may be tested to some extent. And different kinds of tests may bring out these different issues to a different degree. The role of background knowledge is very important when designing and evaluating a test, as it has been found that some reading comprehension tests that are used in the field can in fact lead to moderately good performance without actually reading the passages and answering based on background knowledge. This is one more reason why the questions have to be constructed very carefully and piloted to ensure that they truly reflect the comprehension aspects that we intend. In addition, as we've seen, language skills and general cognitive skills are strongly associated with understanding, obviously, because language and general cognition are involved in understanding and are parts of understanding. So the extent to which language and general cognitive ability are required in order to perform a task must also be taken into account when interpreting reading comprehension scores. Finally, there is this issue of measurement. Because comprehension is so multifaceted, it is not possible to test everything with one kind of question. That means that different aspects are typically being tested within a test, as different questions probe different things, like memory, inferencing, so on. This means that performance on some questions will not be very highly correlated with performance on other questions, because remembering the details of the passage is different from being able to draw the appropriate inferences. This means that reading comprehension tests that are inclusive of many aspects of comprehension will necessarily be less internally consistent and therefore less reliable than tests that are more targeted and therefore might leave out important aspects of comprehension. So a balance among these must be taken into account in a well-designed reading comprehension test.